So other games you might have heard of: World of Warcraft and Farmville. Again, these are games that you know are super popular, and you might have heard about people being addicted to them. But in this series of books, we're interested in, okay, well, how is, for example, in Fire and Summer, how do adolescents, how does this affect their moral development? So thinking about different games like Club Penguin and World of Warcraft, thinking about that. And in Fortuno's piece in the book, he talks about really thinking about, what are the ethics of the way that the game mechanics are balanced in Farmville? What is it about it that maybe makes it so engaging, but is that ethical? Is the way that they've actually developed it and kind of fine-tuned it an ethical game mechanic? And so also thinking about, not even thinking about digital games, what about board games? Thinking about board games like Risk and Dominion and Stratego. So, Consolvo really talks about a personal experience and how people in real life are negotiating borders and, negotiating the way that they play the game in real life. And, for example, Brathwaite and Sharp talk about a game called Train, and it's a game about the Holocaust, and you don't realize when you're playing it, you're trying to win, but the goal of the game is you don't realize the context of it, because you're just thinking, okay, well, I need to move these trains to a certain place, but you don't realize that the trains are going to the concentration camps until the end of the game, and how that might affect the way that people play, think back and reflect on the decisions they made in the game, knowing at the end that it's really about the Holocaust and not just moving people as quickly as possible on a train. So, really thinking about the ethics of that. Not even just the game itself, but what about the stuff around the game? So, thinking about the console itself as a site of development and reverse engineering that, and the ethics of reverse engineering a console like an Xbox. And so that's, something that Schwartz and Bayless talk about. Kandiger talks about the remote itself and the way that the Wii remote specifically, just the ethics of creating something like that and the way that it's developed and how it's part of the game just as much as anything else, and how that affects the gameplay. And then also, thinking about games for education, right? So thinking about how to use games for learning purposes and teaching about ethics. So, for example, for IoT, the Cost of Life that was created by Microsoft and Global Kids and Game Lab, that's thinking about you're following this family in Haiti and they're poverty-stricken, and you're making choices for them about how they could maybe get a better life. And then something like the redistricting game was talked about in Swain's article, his chapter, and it's about the ethics of making border choices when you're polling, right? So thinking about the issues about districting in a way so that you get enough, get just the right amount of Democrat votes or Republican votes, so that you kind of sway the votes in different ways, and thinking about the ethics of that in a very hands-on way. And then also Replay Finding Zoe. That's an online game that addresses gender stereotyping and abusive teen dating relationships. So helping teens really understand that from that perspective, and understanding sort of like the ethical issues around that. And then an article that that's in the book that I talk about is on Mission US, and that's a game that I worked on with Channel 13 and EDC and CUNY, and it's a history game to teach middle school students about historical issues, social studies issues, and it was part of a grant for Corporation Public Broadcasting. And part of the game that we designed was to help them see different perspectives on the Boston Massacre, and to think about what it means to have different perspectives on a specific historic moment. And what happened in the class when they played this game is that after they saw these different perspectives, and each student in the class saw a different perspective on what happened at that Boston Massacre, they were able to discuss and deliberate among themselves and see that there's not just one view on history. And the ethics, that kind of helped them think through the ethics of then, okay, well, what is the right way to see history? And then in the game, they had to decide, do we lie or do we tell the truth about what happened in history? And so the ethics of that became really important in that they were starting to not just think about ethics, but thinking about empathy and thinking about empathizing with different perspectives and different people's points of view, and kind of having a almost historical empathy, which is seeing through the eyes of other people who were there during the Boston Massacre. So that kind of led me to this 2-book series that, all of these kinds of things are out there, and all of these kinds of things or these questions are out there, and no one at the time, and only starting to, people were starting to thinking about these questions. What are the ethical issues surrounding games? What are their potential for supporting the practice of ethical thinking and reflection? What does it mean to be ethical in a game? What is it about games that might even give us a window into our own humanity? What is it about play that might help us access the way that we think through our own ethics and reflect on our own ethics? So all of these questions were really important to me and drove me to create this 2-book series on ethics in games. And I had 3 main goals when I was thinking about it. And I'm curious, for the people out there, I'm very curious, which of these goals seem most intriguing to you? So how do we better design games for ethical thinking? What are the ethics of game production? And how are values reflected and propagated through play? So I'll just share that poll with you now. Just take a few minutes to think. Of these questions, what seem to be the most intriguing ones when you're thinking about this? Okay, I'm just going to give a few more seconds. Okay, so it sounds like the big winner is how are values reflected and propagated through play, and there's definitely a ton of chapters in those 2 books on that. The second place winner was how do we better design games for ethical thinking, and then the final one is on the ethics of game production itself. And all of those are kind of like almost like this triumvirate, right? It's like this triangle of importance, because we need to be good designers. We need to be thinking about, once we do design a game, okay, well, how do we produce and how do we distribute it? And then once it is then out there, how are values reflected, but also how are they negotiated through the players? So the actual, the players and the users, how are they actually thinking about it? Okay, so why ethics? What was it about ethics that was so, specifically intriguing to me? I believe ethics matter so much in our daily lives. How do we know how to act appropriately on Facebook, right? How do we think about World of Warcraft, community like FARC? What are the ethics of collaborating with coworkers in a different country? And what are the ethics of taking an extra stapler from the supply closet? I mean, these are things that we're always thinking about from big and small. How do we identify and assess biases in the news we receive? And what do we do about healthcare, our food supply, global warming? How do we choose our leaders? So there's big questions, there's smaller questions. We need to be ethical, critical thinkers to be able to navigate our globally interconnected, rapidly evolving world, to be able to participate fully as citizens in a democracy. And the thing is that as ethics and values evolve and are reconfigured online and offline, we need global citizens who can think through these issues and choices and decide what is right for them, their families, what is right for their communities, and what's right for the world. And this seems like, these are these are kind of old questions, right? The notion that play can help people reflect on values is innovative in some ways, but it's also as old as humankind, right? Play has always been a way to allow people to experiment, to explore and reflect, to try on new perspectives, to reenact scenarios and possibilities, and to try out different identities, systems, worldviews, roles, all ways that might help us think about the complexities of social issues and to practice critical and ethical thinking skills, right? And one way to support this might be games, right? Why games? You know, a ton of people are playing games, and you know, it's hugely popular, right? It's surpassing the music industry and the movie industry and global sales. But it's not just about the numbers, right? We're not just looking at numbers. Something specific to games that might actually support, there might be something about play and games that might really support ethical thinking, right? And you know, games are situated playground or provide the ability to try on new identities, to take on new roles, to solve problems, to enable alternate perspectives, to look at things from other points of view, to really get into that point of view, and to then simulate the consequences so that you can almost iterate through different possibilities and to see the different kinds of consequences you might come up with. So, you know, it's low risk because you're playing the game, but then there's, you know, you don't have those like real world consequences that you have to deal with. You can just try out different possibilities.